Hi, I'm Wendy Cassens, and this is Dateline RB. On this episode, we'll be talking to author Mark Farina about his recently published book, Casey and the Flying Fortress. Mark, welcome to the show.
It's a pleasure to be here, Wendy.
So if you wouldn't mind sharing with me, I know we talked a little bit before the segment started, how this book came about.
Well, it's kind of a couple stories. I never met my father-in-law, Casey. He unfortunately died of cancer back in the mid-'70s after a long battle, arduous battle. And while I knew he was a bomber pilot in World War II and that he'd been a POW, my mother-in-law and my wife didn't talk a whole lot about it because I don't think they talked much about it at great length when she was growing up. And there were a set of circumstances which the book goes into of kind of almost a guiding force that brought us to a point where I started doing research out of curiosity, more for the family, just, what happened to these guys? Were they all still alive, or did they all survive the POW camp? We didn't know any of that. And it started this journey of research and discovery, and an amazing trip along the way that not only was a trip on the internet and on the phone, but also physically, going to places like the Cape Cod and the Netherlands, and all the way to Europe.
So before we get to that part of the process, if you wouldn't mind sharing with me like your 20-second summary of like what Amazon would summarize the book as being.
Well, I think it summarizes it as a research into a man's past, finding these discoveries, and sharing them with not only my wife's family, but the other crew members' families of items that they didn't even know about.
When I read it, I was most impressed with the different levels of the book. It's definitely a heartfelt tribute to the father-in-law that you had never met. It was clear to see the love you have for your wife and your mother-in-law, but also then the different layers of people that it applies to. But then when you pull it back, it's really about the whole experience for America going into Europe.
Absolutely, and I've always was grateful and impressed with the sacrifices that our military has made over the years. My father's a World War II veteran. He was in the medical corps in Europe and was part of the Battle of the Bulge. And
that could be your next book.
Yeah, and also, he'd be a fascinating book, just his whole life. And he even helped liberate one of the Nazi concentration camps at Buchenwald. So I was aware of that, and I've always been fascinated by history. It's probably my most favorite subject in school. So this was kind of a natural to dig into, and the process was just, at times, very gratifying, but also like any research project, it could be a bit frustrating.
And so you mentioned, and I don't want to give away anything for anyone who goes into the book, this, I would say, divine influence that gets you to this point where all of a sudden your mother-in-law shares some information, and then it went from there, where if you could take me through the process of how it started as this small seed and then has bloomed into this book.
Well, we and the book talks about this divine intervention event that happened when we finally, my mother-in-law, my wife, and our young son Louis, saw a B-17 up close for the first time. My mother-in-law had worked in the War Department as a secretary back in Washington, D.C., but she'd never seen up close the aircraft because she wasn't married to my father-in-law at the time.
Oh, so then there would have been no...
Right, and at the time, and then likewise, years later, we finally saw this, and there was a force that brought us there because it couldn't have been anything else. And the timing was prophetic because my mother-in-law died a couple weeks later.
That part was...
Yeah, and it was when she died and we started going through her personal effects in her condo that we discovered a couple boxes stored away in a closet that hadn't been looked at in many, many years by my wife or her sisters or brother.
Actually, some of the illustrations you have, can you explain to me the cartoons or drawings?
Well, my father-in-law and all the crew members survived being shot down. So they were all prisoners of war in Germany, and a couple of them in Belgium as well. So they were all issued a diary by the International Red Cross.
Interesting.
Which they could use as a diary in any form. Well, we got a copy, thankfully, from the pilot, Hank Rober, of his World War II diary. I don't know what happened to my father-in-law's. and it was just a treasure trove. I mean,
I have chills.
And that's a book in and of itself, really, because I only used just a smattering of what Hank Rober had put together.
And which is interesting that it's clearly, like the title is Casey and the Flying Fortress, but I love how you honor each of the members and clearly tried to reach out to as many of them and the family members, and in the process, unfortunately, not all of them were able to see the book to fruition, but the book is always there.
Yeah, and a couple of the wives are still with us, and we've talked since they've gotten copies, and I know that they're very, very pleased with it. And a couple of sons and daughters as well have gotten copies. So the legacy lives on.
Right.
And I thought the most fascinating part of the whole project was connecting with these people. It was a treasure hunt, and getting their reactions. The first time I talked to somebody on the phone, and just going, "Oh my Lord, it's Casey's son-in-law." We've been wondering about what happened to Casey, after the war, and it was bittersweet too for my wife, because God, she would have loved to have shared this with her mother and with her father, but to have answered, and I was able to answer some questions about other crew members that they'd lost contact with as well. So that was part of the fun and the treasure hunt. Go ahead.
My students often will say, like, when someone writes a book, do they just sit down and start to write it and then they're finished? Because this was not your only thing you were doing. Do you mind walking us through the time,
I had writer's background. I mean, I worked as a journalist, both print and broadcast, and then I worked 18 years in government public relations.
Holy smokes.
So I did a lot of writing, but I'd never written a book. And it started off just kind of as a like I said, an interesting project. And then I started to say, okay, let's put this down on paper and try to write a book and try to structure it in some form, and just start from the very beginning, so to speak, and I would add to it as I discovered more interesting factoids, not only about the crew but also about the war in Europe, the air war, what they faced, all the challenges, and then other sidebar discoveries about certain celebrities that we know of, not only in Chicago but around the world, who played a role in World War II, in the air war. So that was, it's just in structuring it, but there were stops and starts. There were times when I just ran into writer's block, or I ran into a dead end on something I thought was particularly informative, or something new did come along.
Oh.
Even up to almost the time the manuscript was being submitted.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So you also traveled throughout this, because you mentioned that at first, it was happening to put Casey's name in a database and then more information. But then you went to California, you went to Southern Illinois, you went to the Netherlands. Like, how, you've not only spent a lot of your time and effort, but that's a sacrifice that your family, has to make also.
Well, my wife and I traveled out to Cape Cod and Boston to meet the radio operator and his wife, and we spent time, we stayed overnight there and toured around that part of Cape Cod. Went down to the St. Louis area in Southern Illinois and met and visited with the pilot and his wife, which is a tremendous conduit. And then through the discoveries from each of the crew members, we found out about this family in the Netherlands that had sheltered my father-in-law, the pilot, and one of the other crew members for a couple of days before, unfortunately, they were captured. And a book had been written, a book that the Dutch had written, and 2 chapters were devoted to my father-in-law's
Now, were you
plane.
able to see that book?
Yes, I was able to see that book, and other things that we discovered, gifts that he had sent to this family
that added to
after
the narrative.
war. They had somehow reached out to him through the War Department, and he then wrote them a letter and sent them a photo and sent them actually a number of gifts, one of which was a can of coffee, which they never opened. And this lady, who was a teenager then, and now is an elderly lady, she had that can of coffee.
Oh my
still
goodness.
had the can of coffee.
That's incredible.
Which was really something else.
Now, the prisoner of war information was really interesting to me. I've read Unbroken and some other books about that. But the one thing that I was so grateful that you put in is I understood the Red Cross was a part of working with the prisoners of war, but the details that you offered in terms of how they received packages or things were late, or like the heartbreaking thing where the soldier gets a sweater, and he writes a thank you, and the girl is not very nice about him receiving that sweater.
One of the stories was this father of one of the POWs, obviously did not have a particularly good relationship with his son, and writes, I'm not surprised you wound up in a prison. That's a heck of a thing to be getting from your father. It was pretty shocking. Let alone the Dear John letters that you
that's always
would expect.
So sad. Oh.
But it was heart-wrenching, and I would also say I can't imagine the most desperate parts of that towards the end of the war, going through that winter of 1944-45, which was one of the roughest winters on record in Europe. What it must have been like, not only for them, but obviously all the people in that part of Europe who were victims of the war.
And part of the survival of so many, but then that when they came home, for your father-in-law, it was you move forward.
Yeah.
And he continued his service.
Absolutely. He continued his service in the reserves and retired as a captain in the U.S. Air Force. And he suffered some post-traumatic stress issues, which I think came out a little bit later, not necessarily immediately. And probably his diagnosis with cancer certainly triggered all of this bad memories and wondering what, if anything, from that POW experience may have contributed to his cancer.
And so in the process, I was noting, as I read through your experience and then reading the end, like you can feel how you've gotten closer to your father-in-law, and then that this is available to other people, like it might encourage them, to take, it's really a few extra steps opened up this entire story. So how did you come to the end? Like, at what point did you realize, I think
it's time? It took longer than I initially anticipated. Again, because the old saying goes, life gets in the way when you're making other plans, and that was truly the case with us. And I had gotten to a point where I said, okay, I'm not going to dig up in my mind that much more pertinent information that I think needs to be in the book. So let's go with it. Now the question is, I'm an unknown writer at that point. There are people who know me from my background as a journalist in public relations, but aside from that, I'm an unknown writer. So we had to reach out to a number of what they call print on demand or first-time author publishing houses, and you pay for that. It's not they don't come to you. It's not.
You mean you didn't get a royalty check right away?
No, that's the next thing we hope to be seeing, wider distribution. But it costs, and the costs can vary depending on to what degree you went. The thing I was very happy with, and I found was a good decision, was that I had a separate graphic artist, a lady I know through my membership in Kiwanis, Anna Pirro, who designed the cover for me.
It's beautiful.
Because I had a vision for the cover. I had kind of looking through the clouds of time, and she did a magnificent job on that. And I find out that yes, we own that, not the publisher.
Oh,
so,
good.
That's a good thing.
Well, now that you mentioned like going through the clouds, one of your final experiences was actually the ability to fly in a B-17 bomber, which I think is a nice closure to that experience.
It's kind of funny because at first when we went up in this vintage aircraft that's flown by the Collings Foundation from the East Coast, and they could fly all over the country, and got to fly in this thing. And I think the first reaction of the 10 passengers was, wow, this is cool. And we want to go through the different sections of the airplane. But then as we're flying over Lake Michigan on this gorgeous day, about 2,000 feet off the ground, beautiful summer day, and we're in shorts and everything, we're thinking, well, what were the conditions for these guys in reality during the war? And I think things got kind of solemn as we started to make our way back to what was then called Pewaukee Airport in Wheeling. It had different experiences for everybody. I started to feel very humbled because I realized this wasn't the conditions they were flying under. It wasn't fun. It was much different and much more dangerous and incredibly uncomfortable.
So if anyone who is watching our show today would like to meet you, where can they find you?
Well, we do have a book signing coming up on Sunday, February 26th.
Awesome.
It'll be at Half Price Books right there in the Countryside Plaza off LaGrange Road and 58th. And that'll be from 1 to 3 again on Sunday the 26th. And
okay.
Come on out. We'll sign some books. We'll talk with you and talk about the author and publishing process.
Right. And then if they wish to get it ahead of time,
it's available online at Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com, through Author House as well. And I know a few independent bookstores are carrying it, and probably more.
Right.
Soon.
Well, I hope so.
I would think
for your
so.
sake. It's a lovely tribute to your family, and I am so grateful to have been through the experience with you, because you're very giving in the book of your process, and also honoring Casey and the other people with him.
Thank you very much, Wendy. It's a tribute to the crew and their family members and our family, and it's a legacy that I'm very proud of producing, and hope to down the road write a few more books.
I was going to say, we look forward to your next,
right.
tale. Hopefully, another one of nonfiction. I mean, unless you want to write fiction. But
I don't think
this was very good.
Yeah.
Yes, it was very good. Well, thank you so much for sharing your time at Dateline RB with us. If you would like to see Mr. Farina, please go to Half Price Books, and if not, go online and get the book.